Mic check. Hey guys, we're gonna start in a few minutes. So come on in, find a seat. We're live already? Okay. Oh, got it. Perfect. So can they hear me though? Okay. Here, grab this one. right, guys, we're going to begin. Go ahead and find your seats. And I think coffee's ready by now. All right, on a live stream. If we're not streaming yet. Are we? We're streaming. We're live? We're live. Everyone's watching? All right. And we're live. Thank you, guys. All right, welcome. A lot of people got up bright and early. That's great. Thank you so much for coming to this second annual Unconfiscatable here in Las Vegas. We are at the D Hotel. Thank you again for hosting us at the D Hotel. Thank you again for hosting us at the D Hotel. And thank you everyone for coming out and supporting us. This is a one-day conference. We packed even more great speakers for you this time. This is going to be a very quick intro. I'll probably come back up with announcements. And thank you again for all the support. Thank you to our sponsors. And we're going to go ahead and kick off the conference. The carnivory dinner last night was amazing. How many of you were there? All right, everybody enjoyed it, I'm sure. The food was absolutely incredible. All right, so I also want to, just from the start, I want to thank Muzz, my partner and manager, for setting all this up. I don't see him in the room, he's probably running around. We'll get him on stage in a bit as well. All right, guys, without further ado, I'm going to bring your first speaker up to the stage. It is the lovely Mir, and she's going to talk to you about what non-developers can do for Bitcoin. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you. Such a big responsibility. But this is Mir, and what I do in my life, you will discover at the very end of this presentation. Actually, I just want to share with you some of my latest thoughts. So, let's just start. Okay, perfect. So, we all know that Bitcoin can do amazing things for us. Okay. And we are all here because we love Bitcoin, right? And or we're just discovering Bitcoin in any possible way. But I don't want to go into politics, but at some point, I was just thinking about this quote by Kennedy, and ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And I try an experiment with Bitcoin. We all know that Bitcoin is almost perfect, is pretty much unconfiscatable. But what about us? What can we do for Bitcoin? So I tried this experiment.
That was me.
Okay, perfect. So we stay here.
Yeah, so just guys sit here. Yes.
So I will go on. So basically, I asked this on Twitter, and I got so many replies. What I asked was, is there anything we can do if we are not developers? The point is, if we are a developer and we can code, of course there are plenty of things we can do for Bitcoin, cypherpunks, write code, you can become a core developer and really help Bitcoin. But I got so many answers to my question, really, and it was incredible. The community really felt the question I asked them. So many that I got to the point that I could regroup them in 5 categories. The first approach was the one that I called the nihilist approach. There is nothing we can do for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is totally capable to survive on its own. Its human greed are just useful as individual. Perfect. And I really like this guy that told me there is nothing we can do, and at least if I don't do anything, I will have no enemies, so please don't do anything. The other one was the approach that are called the minimalist approach. So it's basically, this is very shared between the community. It's approach that say just run a full node, buy Bitcoin, hodl, and I will add the action just like using conjoint transaction, and everything we can do to make the network of Bitcoin more resistant and helpful for everyone. Another approach that was not very shared is the pragmatic approach, and I meant with this helping Bitcoin while doing your daily activities. Just like with your jobs, or help the distribution, which is very important. But the reply I got more, it was just help Bitcoin creating the resources and education, basically. There are so many ways in which we can help Bitcoin educating people. We can educate people around us, we can start with kids, we can start with lessons in high school. This is answer I got. We can do art. We can use our skills and our creativity to help Bitcoin. Write a book, start your own meetup. It's plenty. Oh, for example, also having your podcast is another action you can have. And of course, all these approaches are all together and are all very effective. But there is nothing we can do for Bitcoin, but I got many lists of things we can do for Bitcoin as individuals. At some point I asked, well, what about if we are, if we can code? And what happened was that I tweeted this, but I wasn't so lucky this time. Nobody answered to my question on Twitter, so I got to figure it out by myself. And I put everything all together in this. Wow. So basically, the first question is, who am I? And of course, we have more identities. So for this scheme, I privileged one identity. For example, if I can code, and also I am rich, but I don't code anymore. I'm a rich guy and on a dev. So there are not all the permutation, but the most important one. So first question is, can you code? And if the answer is yes, I think there are pretty much, those are pretty much the things you can do. The first question is, can you code in production? Which means, can you create some code that go public? If the answer is yes, once again, can you do that with the basic protocol? Are you able to do that, and do you want to do that? You are perfect for being a core dev. But of course, this is something that has trade-off. Because, for example, you don't want to work on protocol, you can develop tools and also user experience, which is very, very important. Nobody is taking care for user experience, but at this point, we really need better user experience. So if you're a core developer, you really have an approach which is very multidisciplinary. You are okay with Bitcoin governance, and also you cannot risk. You're okay with the BIP. You're okay with a lot. But you can experiment with tools, and with tools I mean wallets, for example, or services just like BTC Pay Server, or anything we can develop. If you don't want to code in production, I think there is a very important things you can do. You can read code, so you can give reviews. And we really need more people that are reviewing code, that are giving feedbacks on that. And we are all very focused on the first two, but reviews are very important. So if you can develop, you really should consider to do to give this kind of contribution. What about all of us? I'm not a coder, so if we cannot code, there are plenty of action we can do for Bitcoin. The first question is, at least, are you rich? Because if you are rich, you can really help Bitcoin. How? Sponsor. You can sponsor the best Bitcoin projects. And while selecting the best project, you can, of course, have a deep understanding of Bitcoin. And what could happen could be that at some point you can even start to code. But if you are not rich, at least you are a good user of Bitcoin, right? You're running full nodes, you hodl, you buy, and you do all the best practices. If that, the most useful thing is giving feedbacks once again. And with feedbacks, I mean you use those tools and you really give to the people who are developing feedbacks. This wallet doesn't work, this wallet is weak in this part, and everything. And the dumber in some way you are, the better it is. And we really need more people doing that, giving feedbacks, creating documentation, for example, of this tool is very, very important, and almost nobody is doing that right now. So what about if you are not a coder, you are not rich, you are not a user? Come on, just start right now. Just start doing the best practices. We all know what are the best practices, help the network and buy Bitcoin. And what could happen could be that at some point you always consider that the fact that you are going to be rich and you're going to change your position and start again sponsorship the best Bitcoin project. Of course, there is something that is missing in this flowchart, is the part of education, is the part of also the propaganda, because everyone in this room in some way loves to propaganda Bitcoin in some way with t-shirt or being here or going on Twitter or whatever. Propaganda in this way is a very positive turn, of course. Education is something very spread between all the Bitcoin community. What is happening is just like we have so many people doing education, which is great, but the quality is starting to slow down a little bit. So we really need to do the most effective ways to do education. For example, we really need to think about that. And I really recommend a talk by Goldstein, How to Meme Bitcoin, because also meme Bitcoin is an art, is the art of persuasion. And we really need to reach the right target in doing so. We really need to select which people we have to argue with, to use logical argumentation, and the people we just dismiss, or the people just to have fun with because they don't want to reason. It's very important education. I'm the first one doing education all the time, but be aware of all the other people doing education. So we really need to put all our synergies together and looking if we really need another book on Bitcoin, if we really need another meetup. Maybe action like this, I don't know. We really need to think about that. And one special exemption that I found between feedback and education and propaganda has been a lightning torch. We were testing the lightning, and out probably maybe we can say that we need a lot, many Bitcoin developers. We don't need so many. We need the quality. We need the best one, and in some way, noises can slow many people doing education, of course, and we really need the people using Bitcoin for true. We really need people that sponsor Bitcoin and give feedbacks all the time. So it's almost kind of inverted our. So this put me in a sort of, am I doing the right? Because there are also, we don't have enough time. So the point is trying to redistribute our time and our resources in doing something useful for us and also for the Bitcoin community. So what happened, and it's been that I started working again. This is my job right now because I need some money at some point. And Bitcoin is great because it gives us the opportunity to do an ethical job, a very beautiful job. And this is the company I'm helping right now. We do communication for Bitcoin tools, Bitcoin clients, on everyone that really want to have a proper communication, but with people that are maximalist at the same time. And also I decided to give to my projects some priorities. My priorities right now are just, I started again in my free time the Bitcoin Milano meetup and my personal interviews with people coming at the meetup, which I think is very important. And I really like to do that. Sometimes our action is just something that we really love to do. And I'm starting to write a book with Giacomo. And another things that I really care about is these web series that are going to start very soon. You're going to see. And I decided to really dedicate my time to this project because we don't have a web series on Bitcoin. So this is another media that we can reach with this action. What I decided to cut? Shit posting. There are many people that are doing shit posting all the time. I don't have this time anymore, and people are even better than me. So please help with that. Translation are, I mean, it's beautiful. I'm Italian, as you can hear from my accent, but it takes me a lot of time. I really love to do translation, but I don't have this time anymore. So I found people that are doing Italian translations, and this is something I cut from my life. Another thing I decided to cut is stopping Giacomo from tweeting too much, because you are all grown up. You can mute Giacomo, stop Giacomo, block Giacomo. Please do it. I cannot do this anymore. Please do it. You can do it, I miss. Wife, I cannot do it. And this is all about my dreams. The dreams are action. They are still there. They are going to be in action only if I free some time from the other part. And I think the most important is start to code. I can read some code, but of course I'm not a coder. I think that's very important for two reasons. I have a daughter, and I really want my daughter to have someone to help her with the first steps, and also for the reason I was saying before, I can give some feedbacks and reviews if I can code, but for now I don't have time, but that's my dream. And also, that was my previous job in BHB Network. I knew who was doing what, and I think one thing that is very missed in community and could be very useful is a creation of our skill and putting all together just to make every of other action more effective. And we can help each other in amazing ways. Still, I don't have time, but let's see what happens. And the take home, at the end, at the very end, Bitcoin don't care. But that doesn't mean that our action as individuals are not important, are very, very important. Every of other action can really make Bitcoin more unconfiscatable, more resistant. But we don't have to presume that every of other action have the same level, counted the same. Really have to do the best one for us, of course, and the best one for Bitcoin. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Hey guys, we have a few minutes for questions. We have mics right here on both aisles. Just come up to a mic and ask away. Otherwise, if not, it's excellent.
I just want to show you something very nice that Surfer Jim gave me. And this is another good way to do education in a very creative and useful way. He created this business card with all the Bitcoin resources, the best Bitcoin resources. So it's very easy if you find someone that is really interested in Bitcoin to give this to that person. We can be super creative in the way in which we can educate and help people all the time. I really love this. Thank you very much for giving me.
All right, thank you so much, Mira. It was awesome. Thank you. All right, guys, thank you again for coming out. And don't forget, we have the scammy ballots right there. And if you haven't seen the tweets for the fan vote on Twitter, that only counts for 1/3 of the vote. Your vote here in this room counts for the other third. So if you have not yet filled out the ballot for the Scammy Awards, please stop by right there, those two round tables, and the ballots are there. All right, we're going to just keep it going. Let's bring our next speaker onto the stage. I really respect this guy. I absolutely love the book, and those that watch my YouTube channel know I like to listen to him on tape, and it's not even that often, but this book really helped me understand several things about money. And please welcome Saifuddin to the stage, and his book is right there in a store. He'll be happy to sign it for you after. All right, Saif, click right there, and you're up. Thank you. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me, Tone, and everybody from the organizers, and everybody who's here. Thank you so much for showing up and giving up on a wild night yesterday to wake up early today and be fresh to listen to me talk to you about the Bitcoin standard, only to get scammed and be given a talk about the fiat standard, which is basically, you know, a cheap imitation, as you can imagine, but it's what you're stuck with for the rest of this talk. Basically, this is the topic of my next book. If you remember my first book, The Bitcoin Standard, if you'd read it, you might remember, you know, the first 7 chapters don't even talk about Bitcoin. It's about monetary history. And, you know, up until the 7th chapter, you could have written the book in, say, the year 2000. And then, instead of moving on to discussing Bitcoin, you moved on to discuss the fiat standard, how the fiat standard actually worked. So with the benefit of foresight, of knowing how an actually civilized, advanced monetary system like Bitcoin under the fiat standard, and so effectively, you see that there is the, you know, we came to the fiat standard from the gold standard, under which we had this monetary system that was, you know, obviously here comes all of the pro-gold stuff that Bitcoiners don't like, but I promise it won't be a lot. But essentially, the important thing was that because it was the hardest money, it was the one that was used, and it was being used by central banks all over the world, and all banks were using this one money that nobody controls, so it was international. And foreign exchange didn't exist. It was one international monetary standard for money. And governments in that world couldn't just print money. They had to earn it like everybody else. And so that meant if they ran out of money, if they spent their money on stupid nonsense, they faced serious consequences. And the consequences came up pretty early. And so after World War I, governments began to take over the monetary systems that were centralized in their central banks at that time. Of course, initially it was temporary, and like everything temporary by government, it takes at least 100 years to figure out how to disable it. But I think we have. That's the important thing. But by 1971, you know, we went on this fiat standard. Money was not even nominally tied to gold. The value of money had nothing to do with value of gold, supposedly. And so then we, you know, it's complicated to discuss how this relationship happened, and really ultimately who cares about the drama behind the developers and the node runners of that monetary system, about how they arrived at what they do, whether it was the banks taking over the governments or governments running the central banks. It's all one, you know, one big giant ugly bastard child that they earthed, which is this combination of a monopoly central bank, which is the government protects the central bank, and you have this horrific combination of 4 things that is that are essentially the essential functions of what a central bank does, or particularly the central bank's cash reserve. So this central bank government body, which embodies the fiat standard, how the fiat standard works, if you want the algorithm and the protocol behind it, the way it runs behind the scene, instead of, you know, having miners and nodes and software and forks and all of those things, you have one entity that has a monopoly on determining the money supply for society. That same entity also is a monopoly on international payment settlement, and it's also a monopoly regulator of banks, and it holds all the reserves for all the banks. And, you know, the extra bonus is that it's always ready to lend for your government. Combine all of those 4 together, and you can see how the fiat standard protocol functions. And so, you know, if you really want to think about how it works, I think a good way of thinking about it is that it's a violent, autocratic shitcoin that fully controls its user. It's like the exact opposite of what Bitcoin does. It's a shitcoin because, shitcoin because of the supply, but first it's involuntary, it's coercive. You can't just download the software if you want to. You can't uninstall it. It's malware that throws you in jail, basically, if you don't run it. You have to use it, and if you don't use it, you go to jail and your life is over. Node count is only one. There's one node, full node, the US Federal Reserve, and they think this is efficient and it's much better. The network token is essentially debt. They use some kind of different nomenclatures in each different tribe with their own implementation. They have different colors and names, and they have pictures of their leaders and names of their gods on the papers. But really, what the actual token is debt. In this monetary system, money is debt. This is a very important point to keep in mind. And mining, the process of mining, in a civilized protocol like Bitcoin, mining is done based on proof of work. And when you mine, you increase the supply by making new coins when you solve the proof of work. In the fiat standard, mining is done through lending. When you lend more money, you're creating new money. This is a very important thing to understand about the current monetary system left over from the 20th century, is that when you make a new loan, if you borrow new money, the bank is effectively creating new money. The money supply is increasing. So whereas in Bitcoin, every time you mine a block, a new coins are created for the next 100 years or so. In fiat, every time a bank issues a loan for somebody to buy a car or a house or anything, or companies buying each other, new money is being created. And the effect of the thing that's like the proof of work is obtaining a lending license. The way that you can increase the money supply, instead of solving a proof of work in advanced protocols, you just get a license from somebody in government that tells you that you can lend. And then if you're able to lend, you're able to create money. And the monetary policy is essentially infinite inflation forever. And they have all kinds of voodoo justifications for all of this stuff, which are not worth getting into. But basically, this infinite inflation progresses at haphazard rates every year. You go somewhere between -2 to +10 to sometimes 30%, sometimes 50, sometimes 500%. It's a very erratic protocol in how it functions. And the record of transactions is available only to government, basically, and its spy agencies and their corporate sponsors who are able to obtain it. But you can't look at everybody's, you don't run a full node. You don't get to see everybody's transactions, but some people get to see yours. And so it's important to emphasize a few points that they have a very primitive way of doing proof of work. In Bitcoin, we have a very competitive free market process that allows anybody in the world to mine a Bitcoin as long as they're able to solve the proof of work efficiently. And so everybody's always trying to figure out the most efficient, fastest, best way of solving and creating more money. In the fiat standard, you just need a license to issue a financial institution. Or you're a government and you print money and you sell bonds, and then the central bank buys money from you. Buys the bonds from you with new money. And the critical thing, of course, is the difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin. My favorite thing about Bitcoin, the fiat standard doesn't really have a difficulty adjustment. It's instead of the software deciding how hard it is and how many coins are introduced, a million rules and a million laws determine who can issue credit and when and how much. And basically, because of the broken difficulty adjustment, it's very easy money. The stock to flow ratio, if you look at the last 50 years, for 55 years, from 1960 to 2015, I have this data in the Bitcoin standard, the average supply of the average national currency every year increased by about 30%. So that's a stock to flow ratio of 3, which is, very, very bad. It's constantly increasing in supply. And it's basically a self-sustaining gravy train, because government violence grants banks a monopoly on the issuance of credit and international settlement. You can't just send money outside of your country without going through your central bank. It's a monopoly that's enforced by government, a monopoly of correspondent banking by central banks. And banks use the monopoly on capital in order to finance government spending. So it's self-sustaining in that regard. In some benign implementations of the fiat standard, it's just a mechanism for people who are connected to government to take money from people who aren't. And that's done sustainably for a while. But in malignant implementations, when the malware is really, really, really bad, basically it can destroy the entire economic system of a society. And I particularly got wrecked recently playing with one of the stupid shitcoins of the fiat standard. I talk a lot about shitcoins, but I was using one of those, the Lebanese lira, and now it's completely wrecked. And so remember always, never put in the fiat standard more than you can afford to lose. So, the underlying essentially technology behind the fiat standard is, as I said earlier, a monopoly on determining the money supply, payment settlements, regulation of banks and holding the reserves, and then lending to government, which means that the central bank's cash balance is used to back the local currency with hard currencies. Everywhere in the world, this mostly means dollars. In the US, the backing is gold. But you have other kinds of currencies that central banks have that they hold as assets. And they use this to settle international trade, and they use it to back all bank deposits, and they use it to buy government bonds. So you buy, it's just such bad accounting if you really think about it. Why would you want all of those things to go from the same purse? Why would you want to combine all of those things in the same thing? For me, it's like if you had a house, somebody spoke you into somehow combining the sewage system with the freshwater system on the fact that, hey, that way, you can save on piping. And it's obviously not very workable. And if you try to make it work, you're going to end up paying a lot of money on filtering the water, which is really just very bad design. And so when you try and make the fiat standard work with those rules, it ends up just being a very extremely expensive and stupid way of running a stupid implementation of the gold standard. And really just run it on the gold standard, it's much better. But, obviously they haven't stopped trying to make it work. The use of this means that effectively, if you have all of that money, all of that stash used for the same thing, means that all of your savings and deposits and international trade and remittances have to go through an entity that is a monopoly and that also is tasked with lending to government. What could possibly go wrong? Everyone's money is in the same pot as the government, and there's no alternative. You can't take your money anywhere else. As long as if you want to save or trade or send money internationally, you have to go through this monopoly. So what could possibly go wrong? A lot. Well, the first thing is the universalization of debt. It's just everybody in the world is now in debt. Everybody and everything is indebted because I think the best way to understand that is that because debt is money, the fiat standard incentivizes the creation of money in the same way that the gold standard incentivizes the mining of gold. Bitcoin, the use of Bitcoin as money incentivizes the mining of Bitcoin. Debt issuance is the way that you create money in the fiat standard. And you can read more about this in fiat economic books about how the money is created, but it's undoubtedly true that you make every time new debt is created, new money is created in the fiat standard. And so it's like the process of mining. And once you think about it this way, it makes sense why everybody gets into debt, and it makes sense why debt really is sound financial planning for most people. As a business, it makes sense for most businesses to get into debt. It makes sense for most individuals to get into debt because you're allowing somebody else to print a lot of money, and so that person benefits from putting you in debt. And so it ends up being, more profitable for you to engage in that, usually, than buying cash up front, because that's just ultimately what it is. You're tapping into a process of the creation of money. And so, effectively, this is why everybody is always indebted. I like to use this metaphor to draw the analogy. When in the when the Yap Island people were using the rye stones as money, they kept producing more and more of these
eventually, they had very large amounts of rocks sitting there in the middle of the town square that they were using as money. And it's inevitable that with any kind of money, people are going to always do everything they can to produce more of it. And the reason that gold ended up being so superior as a monetary standard is because it becomes so hard to make new gold, and it becomes so uncertain and so toxic and dangerous that most people just give up. And instead of making gold through digging for it, they just go and decide to work for society in order to make money through working. So in an easy money like the rhinestone, they start making money more and more by producing more and more money, and so you're over-investing in the creation of money. In our fiat standard systems, a similarly primitive monetary system with very unworkable difficulty adjustment, we're overproducing debt. If you look at the world since 1950, particularly since the 1970s, you look at how much debt has just been going up, and this is debt as a percent of GDP. So it's not just that debt is increasing, debt is increasing on top of the increase in the productivity and the economic production. So the more we produce, the more debt we get into. And this is familiar also on the individual level. The more money you make, the more debt you can get into. The more successful a company is, the more debt it takes on, and so on. Because this system incentivizes the creation of debt, as I was saying. And so we see this, if you look at the modern financial system, you see this in how everything is becoming a financial institution in the modern economy, because everything engages in interest rate arbitrage. Because if you're a big company that is able to borrow at a low interest rate, you're able to create a lot of money by lending to people at a higher interest rate. So that's massively profitable. And that's why retailers and banks and software companies and all kinds of people do all kinds of silly nonsense as long as they're able to get as long as they're able to get good credit, basically. And so, my favorite example is IBM. You look at a company like IBM, it has so much money, and it gets such low interest rates, and it invests enormous amounts of money in blockchain and AI nonsense that anybody who's looked at, who knows anything about that stuff, knows that they're not doing anything with their blockchain. I guarantee you, they don't have a single blockchain that for anything. The only blockchain known to have worked in the wild is Bitcoin. That's it. So all of the IBM people, I'm sure, are not using Bitcoin. And yet, as long as they're able to continue to get low interest rates, IBM continues to just proceed in this. And so they're able to secure much lower interest rate than competitors, and they're able to continue to operate in this. And you see it in how retailers are just issuing credit cards constantly, trying to get their consumers to borrow, because every time that a consumer borrows from the retailer, they have to pay back at a 20-25% interest rate or something like that, whereas the company is able to borrow at 2% or 4% interest rate or something like that. Internationally, the debt slavery of the fiat standard functions through just the horrific international monetary and financial system that runs through the international loan sharks of the IMF and the World Bank, who basically have access to these fiat printers of debt of the US government and US dollar, and go around basically trying to find any way possible to shove debt down the throats of third world countries, and any country actually in the world. These organizations are only capable of doing one thing, which is lending money. And surprise, surprise, their answer to every solution, the solution to every problem in the world involves borrowing money. It's funny coincidence in a world in which borrowing money is just printing money that these organizations find that it's a solution to everything. And if you look at their, what they do is, their modus operandi is they go to countries, they give them voodoo Keynesian economics about how, if you borrow all this money and invest it in all these projects, then you're going to become a developed country, and you're going to have a high GDP, and then the tax base will increase, and so you'll make all of this money because you're going to invest according to our modern economic theories, and you're going to become a first world country, and you're going to be able to pay it all back with taxes, because obviously this is all Keynesian central planning and it all works. And so you would expect that you'd be able to pay off all of your debt. And of course, they can't pay off all of their debt. And then they're stuck in a debt crisis and they're constantly repaying the debt, and then it's paying off the debt is just continuously growing as a part of the budget of third world countries, and the IMF is constantly bailing them out and giving them even bigger doses of debt. If you follow the soap opera that is the history of Argentina, you see how it's just the same soap opera repeated with new characters, where every 7 to 10 years they take out a new IMF loan, they issue a new shitcoin, and they start off as saying we're going to implement reforms, and they take in 10, each time they increase another $5-10 billion in the lending, and the IMF is constantly there. The last time they gave them 10, 20, 30 billion dollars, and now they're gonna blow it away, and then they're going to get it again. And then why does that crazy, insane system persist? It only persists because of the fiat standard. It didn't exist under the gold standard. There was no World Bank with a magic printer of gold to go hand out to third world countries back in the 19th century to make them develop. But now we do, and so we hand them out debt, and that's what they're constantly falling into, and they're constantly trying to pay that off. And of course, the flip side of that is that currencies are constantly devalued. As I mentioned, on average, 3%, 30% growth per year. And of course, this leads to high time preference decision making. It leads to people forgetting about the long term and thinking about the short term more and more. It leads to ever-growing government deficits. There's a lot of bad things here. I'm not going to depress you. I'm going to move on to the fun stuff. Let's start going a little bit quickly. But you can read about it in the next book. So governments continue to grow because they can just continue to finance themselves using all of the capital that is available to all of society. And they can fight wars endlessly and just continue to finance themselves. All of the despots that we've seen in human history have operated under some sort of proto-fiat standard, which has financed them. We've never seen a genocidal maniac run on a gold standard. We've never seen genocides financed by the gold standard. Well, that's not accurate. We have, but if you think about the most horrific genocidal leaders that we've had in the 20th century, they all had their own fiat shitcoins that allowed them to finance this. And then, of course, hyperinflation, which is very common in the 20th century, and then capital destruction and flight. People take their money out of the countries, and so all of these third world countries with these horrific monetary systems are constantly losing all of their capital, and they have balance of payment and trade problems. All of this and more depressing stuff you can read about in more detail in the book, in the Fiat Standard. And then you have a monopoly of banks that are really protected from free market competition to a large extent. And then finally, of course, the most important one is just the kleptocracy that it turns politics into. Because if you are a president, if you run a country in this kind of situation, you don't have a pot of gold to manage, and if you mismanage it, you run out of gold, and then local enemies or foreign enemies will kill you, and then they will take over your property, and you won't be king, and it will be over. It doesn't work this way. You have everybody's money, and the more you spend of it, the more you are able to strengthen your position in power at the expense of your people. And so politics goes from who can run the public purse best because they have a hard money, into who can pillage the public purse best because they have a magic printer that allows them to continue to make money by issuing more and more government debt. And of course, the IMF and the World Bank are the big enablers of this kind of irresponsibility worldwide by constantly shoving billions of dollars down to everybody who practices it. If you really think about it, the three drivers of economic growth or any kind of improvement in material life ultimately have to be capital accumulation, trade, and technological advancement. And the fiat standard massively disrupts these by disrupting international trade, disrupting capital accumulation, and disrupting people's ability to engage in long-term planning and long-term investment because of all of the uncertainty that is involved in it. And really, ultimately, I think what the development industry keeps saying about, these poor countries need loan and aid is very self-serving because it's self-serving for the perpetuation of the development industry. But if you actually think about what is good for the if you think about what is good for the poor countries themselves, they don't need more money in the hands of central planners in the central government. They don't need more loans. They don't need more aid. They don't need more debt. They need more free market. They need more capital accumulation, trade, and technological advancement. And that stuff, is not really available in the fiat standard because it is not a free market monetary and financial system. And if only somebody had a free market and monetary and financial system, something like maybe a commodity. Is it a commodity or is it a currency? It's Bitcoin, and Bitcoin fixes this. Bitcoin is really, if you think about the fiat standard in this way, if you compare it as a protocol to Bitcoin, you can see Bitcoin as just such a superior upgrade. And I think this is really what's interesting about it. As a technology of money, it's an infinitely superior upgrade to the fiat standard. Because, first of all, it is the only one that works, because it's the only one that can get around government sufficiently enough to seem to have worked for the last 10 years. It allows for international settlement of payments to become just a purely technological operation without recourse to political or legal systems, which I think is enormously important. You couldn't send money across international borders without going through your central bank before. Now you can do it by clicking a few lines of code. And that just completely changes the way that we function with money and value, and I think in the long term it's just going to continue to grow in this regard. And really, Bitcoin neuters and obsoletes the fiat standard. It makes it obsolete, and it's really, if you think about it, this is in a sense like the glass beads versus the gold coins. The monetary competition applies in this case, and Bitcoin is not gold. They can't just lock it up and ban it very easily. It's much harder. And so Bitcoin is a process of monetizing a hard asset whose supply is fixed, whereas fiat monetizes debt, which is an easy asset. We can always make more debt. We can always find excuses for borrowing more, and we always have an increase in the quantity of debt. So it's much easier to make more debt than it is to make more Bitcoin. So this is, again, glass beads versus gold coins. The more Bitcoin's value increases, the higher the value of the hard money economy becomes. And effectively, we're seeing two economies coexisting, but one has a hard asset and one has an easy asset at its back. And so who will win? You know, let's find out. The interesting thing is, if Bitcoin continues to grow, now, of course, it's a big if. There are no promises. This is not investment advice. And this is just irresponsible speculation. And this is Las Vegas. We'll do all kinds of irresponsible things. So take it with a big bucket of salt. But if Bitcoin continues to do what it does for the next 50 years, think about it. The more Bitcoin is monetized, the less debt is monetized. In effect, the more debt is paid off, the more people pay off debt and don't take on more debt, then the smaller the value of the fiat economy. Effectively, instead of monetizing debt and everybody running around to monetize debt, Bitcoins allows us a technological way out in which we monetize a hard asset instead of it. And so the growth in value, the growth in money supply is limited under Bitcoin, which means that if you think about it, if Bitcoin's value continues to increase more and more, then the people who hold Bitcoin, the value of Bitcoin increases more and more for them, and then the value of their, the part of their financial portfolio that is in the Bitcoin hard money economy increases compared to the USD fiat standard part of their portfolio. They become more and more likely to pay off their debts. Now, currently, this is a very small number of people around the world who are into Bitcoin. But if you project this continuing again for another 50 years, and number continues to go up, and the value of Bitcoin continues to increase, and the number of people who hold Bitcoin and witness appreciation in its value continues to increase, big if, but assuming the next 50 years are going to be, say, 1%, are going to witness as much 1% as much growth as the previous 10 on average. Let's say the average of the previous 10 is we're not going to match it over the next 50. We're going to get 1% of it. Even with these kinds of projections, the increase in the value of the Bitcoin economy will continue to accelerate more and more and more. And the number of people who are able to pay off their debts increase. And so individuals and businesses might move from a debt-based financial paradigm and financial accounting paradigm to a hard asset-based financial paradigm. And you can see this happening to old-time hodlers. If you've been around Bitcoin, it begins to happen to you slowly as Bitcoin's value increases as a sort of your portfolio, and then to a point where you don't need to, if it increases to a point where you can pay off your debts, and this becomes very common, what we're doing is we're reducing the creation of debt. And so effectively, we're unwinding the fiat standard. It's the neat technological solution that allows us to get rid of this giant cancer by basically just unplugging the increase and allowing it to just become less and less significant as more and more of the real economic activity moves to a hard money standard. And so this is contrary to a vision in which Bitcoin causes hyperinflation. This would be the opposite, because what happens is, okay, people will want to hold fewer dollars because they want to hold Bitcoin, but also they're going to want to borrow fewer dollars. And the money supply is not physical bills, the money supply is debt. And so if people want to take on less dollar debt because they just have Bitcoins and they don't care about dollars, if we move to a world in which this happens, then we start creating less and less debt. And we move effectively away from the fiat standard as being the use of it. And so the formatting of the PowerPoint has been messed up, but you can't have everything in life. But there was a thank you there. And my website is saifeddin.com, and my forthcoming textbook is Principles of Economics, which I've begun to write. So I'm working on 2 books right now, the Fiat Standard, whose outline is I just presented to an extent. I'm still working on the outline of it today, so I welcome all of your feedback. But I'm also working on a book which, the Fiat Standard is going to contain all of the ranty stuff that gets people triggered. But I'm going to put it all in the Fiat Standard so that the other book will be Principles of Economics, which will be just a clean, clear statement of the principles of economics. It's a textbook based on the courses that I'm teaching right now. So I've taught Economics 11, the first course, and Principles of Economics, and then the second one begins in a couple of weeks. The syllabus will be uploaded tomorrow on my website. Wait, is it Sunday today? No, Saturday today. No, so Monday, yeah. It'll be uploaded on Monday, and then the course begins in a couple of weeks in March. And then those 2 courses are going to form the basis of Principles of Economics, my textbook, which I've started writing. You can access a draft of the textbook on, if you purchase access to the draft of the textbook right now, and you can, on my website, you can purchase access to the draft of the textbook to see it written as it is being written in real time over the next year. And you will also receive a signed hardcover copy of the textbook. It's going to be a beautiful bound hardcover edition, which I'll mail out individually to people who buy. And meanwhile, I'm also going to be working on the Fiat Standard. And there's also the Bitcoin Standard, which has been now translated to about 11, 12 languages. The Italian was the last to join. And it's soon going to be translated to another 8 or so. So the total is now 19. And these are the languages. So find out where your family, which one your family reads, and send them. And then you can you'll have a whole supply of literature coming your way to annoy your friends and family with over the next few years of Christmas and Thanksgiving dinners. Thank you so much for joining.
Hey guys, Saif left a few minutes for questions. So we have about 5 minutes. Come up to the mic if you have a question and ask away. There you go, we got one. Oh, sorry.
Talk loudly? Okay. So the price of gold has increased like dramatically the last year. I don't think this is individual people buying 1 ounce gold coins from Peter Schiff. I think anyways that this is like central bank buying. Do you agree? And if you agree, why would they be doing this now? Like, it's supposed to be a barbaric relic. The economy is supposed to be, doing great, right? The stock market's all over the world or whatever. Why would they be buying or accumulating gold? Because to move the price this much in such a short period of time, I think requires a lot more money than just individuals buying it.
To be honest, I really don't follow the gold market this closely, and I don't really see what is going on. I think central banks have been buying more and more, like in the last 10 years overall. There's an unmistakable trend of going from selling to buying. But I don't really know if it's responsible for some of the changes in the short term. What's going on? It might be a precursor for a financial crisis or so on. But really, I just don't follow the analog fiat monetary system as closely since I've moved on and upgraded to Bitcoin.
Hey, Saif, you mentioned that there would be less and less debt borrowed as Bitcoin becomes more popular, but wouldn't the opposite be the case if you wanted to borrow soft money to get more hard money? Wouldn't the debt just start to go out of control and spiral?
It would, except with the because of capital controls, basically, debt controls. I think it's highly likely. We've already seen this happen, which is you can't buy crypto with your credit card. We've already seen things like that happen. So I think it might become more and more of a segregated economic system, two segregated economies, in that if you have Bitcoin, if you shitpost about it on Twitter, if you have a Coinbase account, if anywhere on the on all of the fiat standards surveillance, you've showed up as Bitcoin, you're not allowed to take on debt. I think this might happen. I think it's highly likely because of the prospect of attack on the because of the prospect of the speculative attack, that people take up debt in dollars, and that leads to more and more creation of dollars. So I think it might be that eventually you're going to have to choose between having a mortgage and debt and a ball and chain for the rest of your life, or Bitcoin. So good luck on making that difficult choice, I think. But we'll see. I think it'll be interesting if it comes down to that, because then we'll have something similar to the sort of black market economy and a white market economy, or the official state economy in the sort of socialist economies toward the end of the Soviet Union, because you have two parallel economic systems effectively. So it'll be quite interesting to see it if this happens. But yeah, I think this is the when we think about attack vectors about Bitcoin, there's the kind of focus on these kind of apocalyptic scenarios. But I think this is arguably more realistic, that there'll be financial penalties or financial restrictions on people who deal with Bitcoin in a certain way, and not in a way that kills Bitcoin, but in a way that maybe segregates people between Bitcoin and fiat.
Well, say thank you, first of all, for the great intellectual foundation you've given all of us with your original book. And you are the original and first Bitcoin standard bearer. What I wanted to ask, though, is what's your view of Bitcoin dominance versus Bitcoin competition? And just what is, I don't know, what is your view of what currency competition is, and do you see Bitcoin maybe resurrecting the gold standard?
Yeah, potentially. I think, I've discussed this, I think, in my talk here last year.
Repeat the question real quick.
Oh, the question is concerning Bitcoin within the monetary competition and different monies competing, and whether Bitcoin resurrects the gold standard. I've discussed this, I think, in my previous talk last year. I think it's just, I think one way of thinking about it, we don't have much time for me to restate the whole thing, but I'll just say, worth considering the scenario of, say, BitTorrent. BitTorrent shook up media distribution quite significantly when it allowed piracy to happen in a way that was very hard to stop. And that led to all kinds of old media model having to readjust and change. And now we're at a point where piracy and BitTorrent is not as popular as it used to be, say, 10 years ago. But that is not because it's been killed. It's still there. You can still use it. It's rather because people are not needing to pirate as much, because it's the business models have become so much more reasonable over time. in the sense that, you know, instead of having to buy the DVD or buy the movie individually, now people can buy packages and can, you know, you pay one fixed sum. So there are much more reasonable business model than what was going on under the era of piracy, which encouraged the piracy. But once piracy was successful, it led to the incumbents revising and having to adapt and change their business model to accommodate the better, to accommodate the consumers better. But it didn't really, it didn't really displace them completely. So perhaps there might be something like this with Bitcoin and the financial system, in that the presence of competition scares them into getting their shit together, and then their first mover advantage ends up being significant enough that Bitcoin doesn't quite take off. Maybe. We're going to have to watch and see. We'll see.
All right, awesome. Saifuddin, thank you so much. Oh man, I have another question, but I'm sure Saif will take it offline. Hey man, thanks again, and you did great. All right, guys, we're gonna go ahead and move right along. And those were our keynotes for the morning. And now it's time to get into the panel version of this event. Please don't forget, you have voting for the Scammy Awards. Stop by the back. Check out some of the sponsors. We have very few, very, very interesting ones. So go ahead and have a chat. And this is going to be a great panel. We have the schedule up right there. The panel is why Bitcoin is unique. And I would love to bring up on stage, we have Jimmy Sung, we have Giacomo Zucco, we have our lovely moderator, Leah Wald, Johnny Dilly, who I'm sure most of you remember from last year, and Dan Held. All right, so we'll have Leah take it away.
All right, great. Well, Tone did my job there, and so yes, thank you, and thank you everybody. We do have Dan Held, Johnny Dilly, we have Jimmy Sung, Giacomo Zucco, all familiar faces, and we're going to be talking about why Bitcoin is unique. So just to beginning off, Giacomo, simply, why is Bitcoin unique to you?
So I think for two reasons. The first one is that Bitcoin must be unique in order to work. We talked about gold a little bit with Saifuddin in his historical review on money. Gold has some characteristics, and only gold has those characteristics. So you cannot replace it easily from a technical, physical point of view. Bitcoin has some characteristics, but they are technically reproducible in an infinite variety. They are not socially reproducible, though. So Bitcoin must be socially unique, must be a Schelling point, because everybody can just clonate Bitcoin and create their own shitcoin. So either Bitcoin, the real Bitcoin, has some social Schelling point, otherwise it's just infinitely reproducible. So the bad news is that Bitcoin must be unique in order to work. And the good news is that Bitcoin is actually unique for some historical and economical and social characteristics. Usually people talk about two characteristics of Bitcoin. One is the immaculate conception. So Bitcoin was created first in a period in which incentives were good. Like nobody was expecting to get Lamborghinis in 2008 from that paper. Nobody was, the only very committed people was looking into that project. So it started off in a very immaculate kind of environment, both on the incentives point of view and the OPSEC point of view, because the creator is anonymous. Probably nobody will know what Bitcoin is. To replicate that kind of OPSEC now would be completely impossible. That is not to say nobody will never discover Satoshi. That is to say that nobody, I mean, there is a possibility nobody will discover Satoshi. There is no possibility somebody can pull off that kind of OPSEC now under the heavy scrutiny that crypto scam environment created. And the second, the last one that makes Bitcoin unique is, of course, it's a very abused terms, but it's network effect. In product, network effect don't count so much. So you can have Model T and Tesla, you can have General Motors, you can have new products displacing old products, like Facebook and MySpace. At the protocol level, though, so at the low level of infrastructural protocol, network effects works in another way. It's not really the newcomer, but it's actually the first comer, which stays there until there is something 100 times better.
Thanks, Giacomo. Jimmy, yeah.
Yeah, so for me, it's not so much the network effect. That's sort of an emergent property that comes out of the original thing, which is that it's decentralized digital money, and we have never had that before. We've had centralized digital money, and we've had decentralized physical money. Combining the two, Bitcoin is the only asset that's like that. Everyone else has tried, like Giacomo was saying, to create something similar with altcoins and whatnot, but they have not succeeded. Bitcoin is the only one that does that. Now, along with that, there are other things that sort of emerge out of that also make Bitcoin very unique. It has the hardest monetary policy that we have ever seen. And Safeteen's book, The Bitcoin Standard, was very important in that regard because it talked not just about hard and easy money in sort of binary terms, but hard and easy money as like a gradation, right? Like stock to flow ratio, talking about how hard the money was. And Bitcoin is harder money than anything we've ever seen before. And that is extremely unique. And that is that's something that everyone will realize as the economic laws sort of come into play and have the network effects and all this other stuff that are going to keep building it up.
Both great answers. It's unique for me because it's the first technology thing that my mom got me into. That was cool. And secondly, the actual reason why it is because the fact that Satoshi doesn't exist. That's fundamentally what makes Bitcoin different from every other project, except maybe Mimblewimble, is that there is no figurehead which can be approached, attacked, or otherwise attracted to non-purely greed-based incentives.
Satoshi's brilliance wasn't just in the species of money that he chose to plant. It was the season, the soil, and the gardening techniques that enabled Bitcoin to survive and thrive. His go-to-market strategy was brilliant. There was no other cryptocurrency that had Bitcoin's initial immaculate conception, and that I think is one of Bitcoin's most unique value props, is that no one had the expectation of profit when they first started to mine Bitcoin in 2009, 2010. And that is a really unique characteristic that not many people really think about, is that you can never replicate that because now, with, we've got, Grin. With Grin mining, they wanted to have a fair launch. But with that fair launch, everyone had the expectation of profit. So everyone was buying ASICs in the anticipation of that profit. So you can never really replicate Bitcoin's immaculate conception. And so that's what I think is really cool and unique about it.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody. So a lot of interesting topics there, especially from economics, value proposition. So maybe my question to you to start off, Giacomo, is actually, what if we lose some of those? So as an example with Montepetris and DNS, he had to make a decision of a trade-off between privacy and adoptability and scalability. Do you think that the future of Bitcoin, potentially, we may lose some of these unique properties that we love, such as privacy, in order for it to gain adoption?
So I think that if it completely lose some of these properties, for example, completely lose any privacy, then it's completely a failed project. Because without any privacy, I mean, the point we cannot have hard money in a centralized way is that governments took actions to forbid us from having that. You could just have e-gold in the 90s, which is a centralized server giving you digital asset to gold. So it's still hard money, less hard than Bitcoin, but it's still hard money, and it's digital, as Jimmy said, but it's not decentralized. So it just gets shut down. Gold was physical and decentralized, but it was very easy to confiscate because it was like big, bulky, and you cannot hide it, you cannot bring it across borders. So when Roosevelt wanted to just take people's gold, he just passed an act, and he could. With Bitcoin, the only reason it can succeed to be our money is just because the government is not effective into taking it off the hands of people. So privacy is not just a nice add-on to hard money. If money is not dark, it's not hard as well, because it will be forbidden from being and staying hard. If everybody knows that you are running a node, everybody can come to your home and coerce you into running a different node with a different monetary policy. The only reason the monetary policy is hard is because money is dark and has some privacy. Of course, there are degrees, like Bitcoin can be less private than now or more private than now, as I hope with Lightning and CoinJoiner's node and everything. It can get better, it can get worse. The nice thing is that, for example, the internet was really centralized and was not conceived for privacy at the beginning. So during the commercialization in the 90s, the internet got way, way worse. But still, I think we cannot argue that the internet was not some kind of evolution toward like just a centralized newspaper and television. It's still pretty interesting to watch the struggle going on between censorship and freedom over the internet. So even if we lose something, it can still work, but it's better not to.
Yeah, there's a really strong tension here, because to some degree you have you want privacy for the reasons that Giacomo said, but at the same time you want that fixed limit. 21 million, to me at least, is very sacred, right? Like there's a reason why it's there, and we need it there. If we don't have it, it's a problem, right? Because the money's no longer hard, and there's a mathematical theorem that it's literally a theoretical limitation, which is that you can have perfectly binding, or the actual limit of how many coins there are, or you could have perfectly blinding. You have perfect privacy, right? So coins like Zcash, they traded in perfectly binding for perfectly blinding, at least in their shielded transactions. And as a result, when you have a bug like they did, then you can inflate the hell out of it, and that's a problem. Same thing with Monero. They had a similar bug which they patched, where they have perfectly blinding stuff, but it's not binding anymore, right? And that's the tension, is that to some degree, if it's not perfectly bound to the 21 million, then you don't have self-sovereignty. But at the same time, if you don't have perfect privacy, then you're somewhat bound to third parties that may try to come and take things away. So at least for me, the more important thing is the perfectly binding. You need a bound on the number of coins, and you need that hard monetary policy. Otherwise, it loses a lot of its monetary properties, and the scarcity and the hardness and the low stock or very high stock to flow ratio and so on. Those are all things that you need from an economics perspective. From sort of a self-sovereignty perspective, privacy does matter, but also from a self-sovereignty perspective, the binding also matters. So that's an interesting tension, and I would say that I'm okay to some degree of not having perfect privacy in exchange for being guaranteed that bound.
Yeah, so my answer to this is no. Like, it wouldn't be the same system if you lose any of those characteristics. One of the kind of hydraulic tension that Jimmy's talking about there and Giacomo's talking about there would essentially cause the system to fail to meet the criteria it established upon its creation, which is that these are the conditions that make sound money. Assuming these conditions continue, it is sound money. If the conditions do not exist, it's not sound money. And the system is only interesting because of the sound money characteristics. Thus, no.
Yeah, there's a nuanced argument to be made between auditability and fungibility, or privacy and being able to validate that the 21 million Bitcoins exist and that there haven't been any more than the 21 million printed. So I largely agree with Jimmy here that the Bitcoin's value as a gold 2.0 is in that auditability of the monetary policy. And we would want privacy as well, but we shouldn't sacrifice that auditability in the long term for that incremental privacy utility. And some interesting ways to think about this as well, one is that dark market transactions still primarily use Bitcoin, even despite its privacy issues. So to me, that speaks to the network effect, that even with the network effect Bitcoin has, the idea that other coins have these features, like feature coins like Zcash, Monero, those are privacy feature coins. Even though that they have these, I would say superior privacy features, they still don't capture mind share and adoption because of that network effect. So, I think that Bitcoin has some really interesting things in the roadmap that will make it more private. So I think there will be a nice. I think there's a very nuanced argument. I think we're moving towards a nice middle ground where we'll have the best of both worlds.
Something, sacrificing my next answer to add something to this because I think it's interesting. This is a very important point. In the black markets, people use online, of course. People use Bitcoin and not this fancy privacy coin mostly. Why is that? People think that privacy and fungibility are mostly a technical thing. Like if you create something that is some magical cryptography, then it's private, then it's fungible. But privacy and fungibility are social effects. So actually liquidity and network effective liquidity is as important, if not more important than technical stuff for a private or fungible asset. So if you are the only one using the most private shitcoin there, which is Zax, of course, my shitcoin. So it's very private because basically nobody knows who has it. I don't even know if I have it because probably we didn't create it. So we don't really know. But if I'm the only one using that, even if the technology is magic, I'm super easy to detect and to spot. So you have to hide in the crowd to be private and fungible. And to hide in the crowd, you need to have a crowd. And to have a crowd, you need to have liquidity. So if you have Bitcoin and now you want to do a private transaction, so you move Bitcoin on the market to buy Monero, and then you send Monero, and then the receiver will have to send Monero to a market to buy Bitcoin. Sure, the Monero transaction itself was probably pretty private. That's not necessarily true because it depends on the anonymity set, on the ring signature, and the liquidity of the network itself. But also, you will lose privacy in the entering and in the exiting. So either Monero is itself a long-term store of value, so again, it's Bitcoin basically, or it will not really provide you that much as a privacy. So Monero probably is a fringe example because inside the very well-designed privacy strategy, Monero may play some confusing role. But for most of these privacy shitcoins, the point is that it's not the technology that matters. It's actually the liquidity that hides you in the crowd.
Can I add something? So what Giacomo is talking about is the anonymity set that you get to be in for any privacy thing. And the fact of the matter is most of these privacy coins have very tiny privacy anonymity sets. You essentially have a very small group within Zcash, for example, that use shielded transactions. And that's all you're hiding in. If you can identify the 40 people that are using Zcash shielded transactions, you pretty much know anytime that they do any shielded transaction, it's one of those 40 people. Similar thing with Monero. Monero community, I mean, despite all their shouting online, they're not that big, right? It's and you're not hiding in that many. And this is a very important point about being able to hide in a lot of things. You can have the perfect privacy technology, but if no one's using it, then you know kind of who it is once they use it because it's like the 4 people that use it. Okay, it's one of those 4 people. There you go. Very easy.
Yeah. So this speaks to kind of the upper echelons of the fungibility conversation, which is that a sound money needs to meet some minimum threshold of fungibility such that it can be used or is comfortably used for a wide swath of commerce and general transaction sets. But at the upper end of those transaction sets, things like, and this is uncomfortable to say, but things like human trafficking, purchasing firearms, purchasing drugs, those kinds of things that are the tax evasion, that are at the top level of, a very, very sound money enables you to do those things a la cash without there being any kind of insight into it. Whether or not it's a requirement of a digital sound money or any sound money to actually have those characteristics is kind of an unknown conversation. It's like whether or not Bitcoin actually meets that fungibility threshold is ultimately subject to the liquidity set of people participating in similar kinds of transactions proper. It has to do with whether or not you're actually protected in performing those actions. Often has nothing to do with the type of money you're doing. It's whether or not someone's watching for the kind of activity itself.
And to kind of wrap up my thoughts on that, most people would consider fiat paper as the most liquid or the most fungible money out there. You know, if you want to go do an illegal transaction, you're going to do it with a suitcase full of cash, right? Even with that, which is the most fungible money in existence, if you go deposit that at any institution of any meaningful size, even a small size, you could get flagged. So it's not necessarily that fungible because you're going to get flagged immediately when you use a very large portion of it. Or the merchant, you know, some merchants don't even take $100 bills due to that same sort of money laundering concern. So even fiat cash, which is recognized as the most fungible currency in existence, that isn't actually that fungible when you look at the reality of trying to spend large sums of it.
Yeah, we've entered a world where wealth of any amount is now suspicious. Fantastic.
Well, so one more thing that I want to add to this whole thing is that privacy, in that sense, like the actual transacting, it's more a method of payment use case, right? Whereas the binding, the 21 million limit, that is much more a store of value thing. And I think for us as a community, store of value is way more important right now. And privacy does have its place, especially when you're doing transactions, especially on the things that are sort of gray or black market. But like making sure that the monetary policy is fixed, that requires some, that's the more important thing for me, and I think that's the one that we should focus on.
So at this point, I started the anarchy here, so I finished it. So yeah, so remember, first of all, liquidity is even more important technology for privacy, and second, not every privacy techniques in Bitcoin requires sacrificing like the hard supply cap. Some do, like the fancy cryptographic stuff. They may be used for inflation bug and they may disguise inflation bugs. Some don't, like using Lightning is not compromising hard cap, and if done properly can increase privacy. Coin joining, coin swapping, is not easy to do that now because of the wallets. Wallets are not ready for that, but it can be used. Bitcoin is fungible since day one at the transaction level because there is no technical link from input to output. The only social link is that wallet developers, for obvious reasons, made so that when you spend inputs, the inputs are all yours because doing otherwise is still difficult, requires coordination, and outputs are basically the payment and the change. But there are a lot of things that already with the protocol as it is at day one from Satoshi's client, you don't have to change anything to make every Bitcoin dirty and flagged. And we want every single Satoshi to be as dirty as we can.
All right, I'm going to move to Dan before more anarchy ensues. We all do love it, though. Thanks, Giacomo. All right, we're on the back of Hester Pierce's SEC Safe Harbor. I'm going to move to the best conversation of regulation, which is just what type of regulatory environment would you want to see for Bitcoin, for financial markets, and also to add to that, and how would the rest of the altcoin market, shitcoin market, fit into it? Would it be separate? How would you see wholesome environment?
I'm a libertarian, so I don't really believe in any sort of regulation. So I'd like none. You know, that would be my preferred regulatory environment. You know, I haven't delved too deeply into this topic. It's not something that I spend a lot of my time thinking about. I like to build systems that have permission. So I like to think in that sort of white space. You know, Bitcoin is, I think, very clearly defined by the different regulatory alphabet soup agencies in the US. It's somewhat of a property/commodity. I think Bitcoin and other crypto assets like Litecoin, and those are, I think, pretty clearly in that category of like a commodity. You know, the other coins like ICOs, I mean, it's basically, you know, Bitcoin's digital gold, and those are like twine and bark. It's like pieces of garbage you want to buy and speculate on. So, you know, I think a lot of those are illegal securities. I think that there's a lot of regulatory capture there. You've got very powerful VCs in Silicon Valley who have sat down with the SEC and had conversations that I'm sure were in the effect of, don't make us lose tons of money. This happens across all industries. A lot of regulatory capture occurs, and there's no doubt that these sort of conversations probably happened at some point in time. ICOs are, I think, pretty definitively securities. As I think Clayton said, I haven't seen an ICO that isn't a security. So I think ICOs are pretty clearly in that security category, but I'm not a regulatory expert, so this is just more of an opinion.
Yeah, so Bitcoin has the benefit and I guess the cost of, in the United States, it's now a money, a collectible, a commodity, a security, and an option, all at the same time, depending on which judge or jurisdiction or three-letter agency you ask. So it's all of those things and none of them at the same time. When it comes to ICOs, 100%. Majority, it has to do with regulatory capture, and the long arm of the law is going to end up kind of suppressing and increasingly enforcing Howey test-like constructs around those kinds of systems. Unfortunately, the biggest thing in the regulatory framework right now that's about to affect Bitcoin is the travel rule enforcement. And unlike Dan, I actually do spend way too much time following the regulations. But the travel rule is basically it's very straightforward. Anytime any amount of money over $3,000 moves between two financial institutions, and a financial institution is basically anything that has custody. So in a Bitcoin case, any one exchange that has keys that can sign on your behalf, anytime that institution moves money from itself to another institution on your behalf, they're required with that transaction to include 10 characteristics. The sender's name, yes. The receiver's name, the financial institution's name, their address. The receiving financial institution's name, their address, the amount of money, an option amount of field. If you fail to do this in a transaction, the minimum fine is $5,000 per day per violation. 20% of Bitcoin transactions today go between financial institutions.
Well, with regard to regulation, I mean, I'm kind of like Dan. I really try not to pay attention, and I like permissionless systems for that reason. But the thing that really rankles me is that Bitcoin is treated the same as all of these shitcoins and ICOs, as if we're all in the same category. We're not. Bitcoin is decentralized. All those things have a central point of failure, and that's why they can. I mean, they should be a lot more scared than we are about regulatory issues. And this is constantly brought up in Silicon Valley and other places for that reason, because a lot of these VCs, they know that the companies that they're funding or the ICOs that they're funding or whatever, they have strong central points of failure that if regulated, they're going to go bust, or they're going to lose money or something like that. There was a stablecoin project called Vays that collected a ton of money from Silicon Valley VCs. And they ended up just giving all the money back because the regulatory environment was just so sucky. They knew that they had a central point of failure and that they wouldn't survive it. And this is the folly of all of these ICOs and things. You're basically trying to create money without the state's permission in a centralized way. This is what brought down Eagle. This is what brought down a lot of these previous things. And I think the same fate awaits them. The nice thing about Bitcoin is that it's actually decentralized. And that means that they can't just go shut somebody down. There's no door to knock on and say, hey, you guys, we need you to change Bitcoin. We need more paperwork done every time you do a transaction.
I never understood the profit motive behind stablecoins. Like, why? Like, how is a business supposed to make money when its entire context is remaining the same value?
Well, so they were an algorithmic stablecoin, and based on demand, people will get paid out or something like that. That's why
even more of a disaster.
Well, that's why it would have been classified as a security. So that's why.
Oh, so, I mean, can't we ask Craig Wright though to change Bitcoin's code?
Well, if they knock on his door, I wouldn't be sad.
So I'm a libertarian as well. I mean, I just try to be logically consistent, and you cannot be logically consistent if you are a statist. So I'm against political violence, censorship, and I hope that doesn't happen, of course. I hope that everybody's nice and nobody go beat up other people in order to steal their stuff or to hurt them. So statism and regulation. Also, Bitcoin is already regulated enough by math. So Bitcoin has, I mean, we were talking about cap of 21 million. That's regulation. Bitcoin is already regulated, and that's it. And we don't need any other regulation. But if this kind of violent political censorship, which fancy kids like to call regulation, must happen, I have a little bit of mixed feelings, because probably I really hope that this happen sooner than later, because one of the failure mode that I can see is actually, you know, that the Mao strategy, instead of just jailing dissidents in China, you leave them free for a few years, and then you sign names. So they get weak, they get soft, they get spoiled. They don't think adversarially, and they don't prepare for adversarial situation because they think it's fine, and then you just hit them at the end, and you just kill everybody which name you just signed. So this situation may be worse than just having. I mean, we created Bitcoin to survive to government censorship about and monopoly about money. If the government doesn't really get serious soon, we may get soft, and that's also one of the reasons we have centralized shitcoins. The reason we have those is that the government is slow, inefficient, inconsistent, not constant, not homogeneous. So we may start to think we really don't need those difficult, hard characteristics that would make Bitcoin resilient. So in a way, I hope that evil people will not just aggress other people with aggressive violence. But if they have to do that, and I think they will do that eventually, it will not be bad in a way to have that sooner than later.
A lot of people look at Bitcoin's security model and they wonder if that's too much cost, or a level of security that is over the top. But I think, how many people here have heard of Fermi's paradox, which is essentially like a calculation of a bunch of different assumptions that you plug in to come up with how much intelligent life should live in the universe. The thing is, even if you plug in any sort of variables there, we don't see any energy displacement across the universe that would signal that there is a, Star Wars-esque style civilization. There's no giant spaceships, there's nothing. And so, there's people hypothesize, why don't we see anything out there? And there's a hypothesis that there's a great filter event where all advanced civilizations die after a certain moment. And I think with cryptocurrencies, almost all of these shitcoins will die at that moment when states actually start to care. Right now they exist for a long time and they have terrible security and they're centralized. But that moment that states start to care, that's when they start to pop. And I think that's a future, event in the future that will happen.
Fermi coin.
Fermi coin, yes. You can buy the pre-sale now.
Giacomo, what do you think people misunderstand about Bitcoin most, and potentially where do you think that misunderstanding comes from?
A lot of stuff. Basically, there are a lot of misconceptions about Bitcoin. Mostly that some characteristics, some features that you like, you can get those alone and without the others. So again, I want complete privacy, so I can just give up hardness of money supply because whatever. But that's not true, because when you have a soft, easy money that completely replaced by hard money, even if you have privacy, nobody uses that, and so you don't have privacy, which is the example of before. And the other way around. I just want hard money. I don't like privacy. Please KYC us all and AML me completely. I'm fine. Oh, if that's the case, you didn't need Bitcoin at all. You could just use like gold in the last century, because if you are not adversarial, you don't need Bitcoin. So you cannot have one characteristic without the other, and that applies to many characteristics in Bitcoin. And the second misconception is basically that every feature and characteristic that you have, you can just increase it for free without any trade-off. I mean, not only you need all of those in order to, as Johnny said, you need all of those at least to a certain threshold in order for the whole mechanism to work, but mostly when you try to have too much of one, you will lose some of the others. So perfectly binding versus perfectly hiding, or scalability versus auditability, because nobody runs nodes anymore if you have many transactions. So there are a lot of trade-offs there, and it's not like people that doesn't really understand, that doesn't really try to replicate the Bitcoin experiment in their mind, they may think that you can just move you can just move, just press the button like, I want more of these, more of these. Actually, anything comes with very, very serious trade-offs. And that's something that people is not, easy consumer technology doesn't really make you think about trade-offs. Like everything can be easy, just give me the easy path. But the easy path comes with some serious trade-off, and you have to think about that.
Hey, the biggest misconception for me is, I have a couple. So the first one is decentralization. There's this sort of sense, especially by a lot of altcoiners and people that are creating these projects, that decentralization is just like a feature that you can add to the system. And this is definitely not true, right? As soon as you have somebody or a company or any funding entity that tries to make these, you realize right away it's centralized, right? They're the ones that are creating the software. They're the ones that are making the thing. They're designing everything. That's the biggest one. People think it's like a feature that you can pluck off the feature tree and just put into your product. You can't do it. In fact, in the digital realm, Bitcoin is like the only coin that's managed to get there, and we're not really even sure how it did, right? To some degree, it had something to do with its immaculate conception, the fact that Satoshi disappeared in 2010, and a bunch of other things. But we're not, like, the fact that we don't really understand it is like just sort of beyond a lot of people that are very arrogant to think that they can just add it to their platform. The other one that really annoys me, and it's a giant misconception, is that especially in Silicon Valley, a lot of people think of Bitcoin as a technology, right? As if, I don't know how many times I've heard the phrase, my coin is the Facebook to Bitcoin's MySpace or something like that. And the thing being like, oh, it's a technology. If you just iterate it or add one more feature, it's so much better. And this leads back to the previous one. Decentralization is not a feature you can just put into your product, right? You can have 5-second blocks or 1-second blocks or TPS of 1 billion or whatever. None of that matters because it's not decentralized. The most important emergent feature out of Bitcoin is that decentralization. It's the fact that you have self-sovereignty over your own money. And if you can't add that, well, then your project's kind of a useless fiat shitcoin. And that's essentially what most of these, actually all of them have created, all the altcoiners. So it's not a technology, it's a money, right? And you can't just, quote unquote, improve it by like tweaking one feature. I mean, this is what started the whole altcoin movement back in 2011 when, essentially the only one to emerge out of it was Charlie Lee with Litecoin. And all he did was change the proof of work algorithm to script and change the block time to 2.5 minutes instead of 10. And like he thought, well, those two are better. Those two are better. Therefore, it's a better money. And that was the argument for all of those Litecoin advocates.
It's faster.
Yeah, it's faster, and it's a ridiculous argument because you're not getting the most important property, which is it's decentralized. Bitcoin is decentralized.
The funny thing is the 2.5 minute block times it actually ends up being a bit of an attack vector if you dive into how selfish mining and other mining attacks end up working, which is kind of funny. I think we're remiss. I mean, I agree with the political philosophies to some extent of the lack of the need for lack of violence and lack of force against those who are choosing to kind of seize their own destiny, to be self-sovereign when it comes to their own money. But being realistic about it too is the United States government, thanks to the Patriot Act, can operate with impunity anywhere in the entire world. They can extract a person basically from anywhere in the entire world for breaking a law, except for the Cripsy guy who's happily living in Western China somewhere. So the extent to which you have to be realistic about the characteristics of your system and how well it can hold up against the might of that institution, which is literally the United States Treasury. You have to be very realistic about it, and I would say the majority, if not all, of the Silicon Valley-based initiatives in this space really discount that because they're used to a conversation where they're able to drive the language and context of the regulations themselves, thanks to some degree of the capture that they've had over the years. But those contexts can change on a dime. And if you've been following the way that this current administration does things, that dime can flip real quickly.
So I've got two misconceptions that I'll cover, but I want to touch on the Silicon Valley aspect because I've been living in San Francisco for the last 7 years and have been a member of the Bitcoin community there since January 13. Silicon Valley, engineers are largely worshipped in Silicon Valley, and they're very much tinkerers. They want to go tinker with stuff. And so when they found Bitcoin, they're like, oh, what if I could just tinker with it? What if I changed block time or 210 million hard cap or whatever you'd like? And so I think Silicon Valley, there's that temptation to tinker with something is just so irresistible that they can't handle not doing that. That it's just irresistible for them to do. The two biggest misconceptions I'd like to cover, one is that, salt baying blockchain on something doesn't make it valuable. You can't just sprinkle blockchain on it and then it's immediately awesome. Blockchains suck. They're really, really bad at almost everything. Bitcoin, blockchain was built to build Bitcoin. That's it. I mean, to believe that either Satoshi had no idea what he was doing with blockchain technology is ridiculous. The idea that he just kind of randomly shit out Bitcoin as the first application is just beyond absurd. And if you look at the trade-offs that blockchains make, it's pretty obvious that a sound money is basically one of the only things you can do with it. And the second is, peer-to-peer cash. Oh, the Bcashers, they love that. They love that term. That you see Roger consistently highlighting peer-to-peer cash and tweeting it almost every day. Okay, so cash in the context of the white paper is a reference to, Adam Beck, who is in the crowd. You got Hashcash, eCash. These are references to payment finality and some measure of privacy. It is not referring to cash in your pocket. That is not at all what Satoshi referenced in the white paper, and then is not at all what he wrote the white paper and published it in the cryptographer email list. And these are cypherpunks. So it's largely a marketing paper to a group of individuals. So he wanted to craft copy that resonated with them, and that's why he uses the word cash. But I feel like that is one of the biggest misinterpretations in the space.
Let me just double down a little bit on this. It's incredible. This is one of the misconceptions that really triggers me because, think about cash, even physical cash in your pocket. So if you try to send money with PayPal across a border, that's not cash at all, and it's very cheap and fast to transmit over distance. If you try to put cash, physical cash, into an envelope or a box and to ship it, that's cash, way more cash than PayPal. That's the definition of cash, and it's slow and expensive to send. So cash doesn't mean cheap and fast to move at distance. Cash happens to be cheap and fast to move when you are in the same room, which is basically never the case for commerce. So basically, cash is not cheap and fast. Cash is slow and expensive to move, but with some other features, mostly privacy. I want to be paid in cash because I want to go dark, and zero or reduced collateral risk, so reduced counterparty risk. So I want to be paid cash because I don't want to have debt or credit because I don't want counterparty risk. That's cash, not cheap and fast to move. Sorry.
Yeah. The other thing about if you read the first page of the white paper, it's very clear what Satoshi meant by cash is lack of a third-party intermediary. Lack of a third-party intermediary. It wasn't about being able to send quickly or anything like that. It was about the fact that there's no financial institution in the middle, like Visa or PayPal or any of those. That was what he was fighting against. And it's kind of crazy right now because at least in Bitcoin Cash, what's going on is that they're about to have a split over the infrastructure funding proposal. And part of that is because there's a third-party intermediary. They basically put the miners in charge of everything, and surprise, surprise, the miners are telling them what to do, and they don't like it, right? Like there's a whole, they're realizing, oh, is this what we signed up for? We said the miners are in charge and that no one needs to run a node. Now the narrative's all changing. They're like, oh, I guess we need to run nodes because otherwise we won't know which chain we're on and all this other stuff. So yeah, like that whole narrative is just ridiculous. Cash is about lack of third-party intermediary, and it's the ability to do a transaction without one.
Thanks, Jimmy. Okay, Giacomo, speaking of running a node, did you want to say anything on that one? Okay, I learned from you in your workshop how to run a Bitcoin node and a Lightning node. So my question then is regarding unique properties in new technologies. Doesn't need to be Lightning specific, but I'll ask you Lightning specific. You know, what would you like to see Bitcoin grow with all the latest developments? You know, what most excites you, I should say, about the latest developments, and why? Why is it that, you know, Lightning is so excited to you, various developments are so exciting to you regarding Bitcoin's value propositions?
So first of all, if you learn how to run a node during my workshop, we have failed because the purpose was to shock you and to really depress you and to show you how difficult it is to run a full node in a proper way without trusting a counterparty. Because now, I mean, there was a lot of narrative about run your node during the New York Agreement attack and stuff like that. So everybody was telling everybody run your node. But then if people just start to buy a box by somebody, by a centralized company, and plug it, okay, they're running their node, but still you have a central point of failure, just as much serious as the miners. So the point is that you should do that in a way that is auditable, that it's not really dependent of a single source of trust, and that's where it becomes really, really difficult. And the purpose was to show people how damn difficult it is. So now you can do the easy thing, but you must know how hard it is and how many assumptions you're doing. Things I'm excited about are, in general, I think that the things that really excite me about the new development is layerization, because the big trade-off and the paradox that you have is that in order to make Bitcoin resilient and anti-fragile, you have to be able to make it better over time. But if you change Bitcoin too much, that's basically violates the main feature of Bitcoin, which is stability, reliability, auditability in the long term, status quo preservation. So you want Bitcoin to be hard not only to produce but also to change, but then you want to change stuff to make it better. Layerization is a thing that can really win. I mean, you still have trade-offs, but you can now play with trade-offs on different layers, and that's way better. So you can keep the base layer very, very strong on one extreme of the trade-off, and then you can move the other layer on another extreme of the trade-off. So you can have the base layer like very, very resilient, and the upper layer can be very, very exciting, very, very, very vibrant of new changes. And you can have like a lot of auditability at the base layer, and you can have a lot of privacy and fungibility at the second layer, for example, with Lightning, or the great stuff which is signature aggregation. So the great stuff that can come later is that right now we cannot aggregate signature, but with an eventual possible Schnorr soft fork, you can aggregate signature, which means that a lot of stuff can actually happen outside Bitcoin. And then the only thing that Bitcoin network sees is just one signature, which hides a lot of external complexity. So that's great. Layerization is a great thing.
Yeah, so the things that make Bitcoin unique, the big one is the hard money aspect, right? And with regard to that, if you care about hard money, then you care very much about the security around your Bitcoin. So the things that enhance the security of your Bitcoins, and part of that is privacy, obviously, being able to hide whatever it is that you're doing. Taproot, I think, gets us at least a large part of the way there. You can't tell by an address whether it's pay to pub key hash or pay to script hash, or you have no idea under what conditions you're going to be able to spend it. So that's, and you might have several paths and you spend on one of them. So that level of security or the ability to hide, that I think is that's for me the most important part. I like Lightning, I like the technology and all that, but for me that's a little bit more later. Although with Strike and Escher and these apps that allow you to receive payment in fiat, but you get paid in Bitcoin, that's exciting because that's a store of value technology, right? At that point, it becomes something where, I go and sell my wares, and whatever goods or services I have, I'm able to receive in either one, and immediately I get in Bitcoin. That accumulates Bitcoin for me. That enhances the network effect of scarcity instead of like buying a Dell computer with Bitcoin and then they just go and sell the Bitcoin. That's essentially me selling Bitcoin. This way, it's more about me buying Bitcoin, and having security around that, allowing for that sort of use case. Those are the things I'm excited about.
Yeah, for me, it's the continued kind of sound stewardship of Bitcoin Core proper, which we should thank our lucky stars. We have such moral stewards for the protocol. It's also that with AgSigs, Schnorr signatures, and Graphroot or Taproot, whichever ends up being adopted, hopefully, who knows, maybe we'll never be able to soft fork ever again, and that ends up speaking to the hardness of the protocol itself, which would be great. So either or is great. We're definitely trending towards a world where making significant changes to Bitcoin is getting increasingly more difficult, which is great. It's a very good thing. It's very counterintuitive, and it's very counter to the Silicon Valley, methodology of move fast and break things. Whereas Bitcoin is more like move ever slower till we literally don't do anything, which is great. But the most exciting long, like medium term kind of improvement will be what I call simultaneous open and close, which is once you have these signature coordination capabilities that come as a result of Taproot, aggregated signatures, and Schnorr. We can do them right now. It's just very kludgy, but once we have the more sophisticated methods, we can do them more easily. It enables us to coordinate actions amongst ourselves as we enter and exit the Lightning Network, and that blows up the search graph for chain analytics firms or what have you, corporate actors, nation-state actors who are evaluating the network's topology. It blows up their search space beyond them being able to realistically, accurately taint coins for whatever activity of commerce they may have been used in or not used in. And in the long run, the participation of governments and corporate actors in the Lightning Network as nodes facilitating payments is a success condition for Bitcoin, because in the long run with the Lightning Network, in order to surveil the Lightning Network accurately, you must have funds in the Lightning Network. So if regulators are required to hold Bitcoin in order to monitor the status of the network, we have totally won.
So I think we've had enough geeking out on the core protocol stuff. I'm, my background's in product and marketing, so I think the marketing aspect of Bitcoin has never been better. I mean, back when we were all into it earlier days, Bitcoin marketing was terrible. It was Bitcoin Talk or Our Bitcoin, and then it moved to Twitter. But we've got great content creators. We've got videos, podcasts. We have conferences that are Bitcoin only like this. I mean, this is a dream, I think, for propagating Bitcoin's narrative, having really great content. Not everyone is as technical as we are, and I think a lot of people have done a good job of condensing and compressing that narrative to make it easy to understand, and I think that's something to where we're going to see it continually compressed and become easier and easier, to where I know we've all had the conversation with our family and friends trying to get them into Bitcoin. It's always very tough. But eventually there'll be some content that comes out that's going to be so easy that you might actually convert someone based on just one Medium article or one video. So I'm super thrilled to see that continually progress.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, gentlemen. And I am opening it up to Q&A, and it looks like we have our first question right here.
My question actually has two parts. Going back to the fungibility and the whole privacy issue, and using coin joins. When people are using them, is the object to hide the person or the coin? And then the second part is, if we're getting to a point where you're worried about the Satoshi, like you said, dirty Satoshis, if you're selling T-shirts, do you have to be worried that every purchase or every time I sell a T-shirt that I accept on the Lightning Network or I accept Bitcoin for it, that it would be, what you're calling a dirty Satoshi? So there's two questions in one, I guess.
I'd like to take the second instead of explaining how conjoin
Yeah,
works.
I can take the first one. So the purpose of a coin join is to make it so that the outputs of the coin join are indistinguishable from all of the participants in the coin join. It's why if everyone participates in a coin join for the same value, and then we all have outputs that are the same value, now we can't know who, an observing party can't know who any of the instantiating parties' resulting addresses are. It's why simultaneous opens and close that involve Lightning are so interesting, is because now we can have higher order coordination events amongst groups, where we can say, all right, so here's a time of day, 100 of us are all going to open a Lightning, we're going to all participate in an aggregated signature event, where we all, for the same amount of Bitcoin, all open like the exact same size Lightning Network kind of capacity channels, and in the future, we will all simultaneously close our channels to new addresses for the same amount, or slightly a smaller amount in the event that there's any payments that actually occur on Lightning. And as a result, you've now added CoinJoin to the kind of myriad ways you can move coins throughout the Lightning Network, and then the output itself is also another CoinJoin.
About dirty satoshis and clean satoshis or KYC satoshis. The point about KYC is not just that it's a threat to Bitcoin. If you whitelist Bitcoins and you blacklist Bitcoin, you break monetary fungibility. And it's not just like ethical because privacy is important and because freedom is important. The promotion of ubiquitous KYC it's economic illiteracy. So think about what money is. What money is a tool that allows the merchant to finally not know his customer. If you know your customer, you can exchange your product and service for other products and services and just trust him. You can. You don't need to know your customer. When you go to any kind of shop, you as a customer, you need to know the shop because you cannot verify the product or the service beforehand. So you need to trust the merchant. But the merchant uses money instead of barter because so that he can avoid trusting the customer or knowing the customer at all. The reason we use money to scale trust outside the circle of knowing your customer. So if you need to know your customer, you cannot trade. The reason that people think that now there is a KYC regulation that doesn't destroy trade is that it is not really true. What we have now, it's a monopoly, as Saifedean explained. Banks have a monopoly on money laundering. So basically, when you receive money, you have to just know that it comes from a bank, and so banks will just spare you legally from having to know where it was before and before and before. And with cash, there is a regulation that said that when you receive like fiat cash, you don't have to know where the cash was before. The fact that exchanges are now promoting the narrative that you can and you should and you would have to reconstruct the history of the money you are receiving is just complete economic illiteracy. Any system where you are required to know your customer for real without the money laundering banking system, then it's a system that cannot work for trade because trust doesn't scale that way. You cannot be supposed to know your customers and do trading. You should not know your customers.
Wait, do we have time for one last question or no?
Yeah, so one final question would be probably for Johnny. You mentioned Lightning Network and Taproot being able to really obfuscate all of the chain analysis and stuff. Could you maybe, without going into too much technical detail, explain a little bit how this next upgrade combined with Lightning can really mess up the chain analysis type of analytics, and how realistic do you think that is happening and getting widespread support within the next 3 to 5 years?
It just enables strong proofs of coordination. And when you have those that can occur as a result when they're nested in the chain, it means you can take off the burden from application and product developers from having to build those harnesses themselves.
Yeah, the other one I think that's going to be really interesting in that regard is cross-input signature aggregation. That's probably not for Taproot. So Taproot doesn't include that, although it's mentioned in the BIP. But probably Segwit v2 will get something like cross-input signature aggregation. And what that means is, right now, if you have 10 inputs, you have to have at least 10 signatures. Or if it's multi-sig, it might be a lot more signatures. With Taproot, each input only really needs one signature, which is kind of nice because all Schnorr signatures can be aggregated per input. But if you have cross-input signatures, all 10 can have one signature. Now it becomes logical and economically rational to do coin joins. Because if you join a coin join, you have to pay less. You pay less fees. So once you get to that point, then like it's open season, right? Like every company is going to argue, okay, well, we're paying out all of these customers, but we're using industry best practice. We have to go join this large pool of coin joins because that's best for our bottom line and so on. And you know, like if we have a good fee market around that time, that's a huge incentive for everybody to sort of mix their coins together. And that and you know, I think Lightning Labs, one of their big projects or one of their paths to revenue is doing submarine swaps with a lot of Lightning channels. So right now, if you want to refill your Lightning capacity, you have to do a submarine swap, and that's a single transaction on the network. What they can do is basically have like multiple Lightning channels be filled with the same atomic swap. So at that point, it's like, well, you closed your channel, or I mean, you're refilling your channel, but you have no idea which of these it is. And it's like better for the blockchain because you're getting there's less block space being used for these submarine swaps. So yeah, pretty cool stuff.
Do you think quantum computing is a threat to Bitcoin now, in 10 years, in 50 years?
No.
Okay. So quantum computing is cool because you can do like interesting physical simulation, and quantum supremacy was a cool thing because you can do stuff with physical simulation. The problem with quantum computing with regard with cryptography is that to go to the level to break something like breaking a CDSA, you need thousands of logical error corrected qubits, and each error corrected qubits means thousands of physical qubits together in a way that we don't even know if it's physically possible. So we are at the level. The question right now is, we are basically in the Alexandria Bibliothèque in 300 before Christ, and we see some steam engine, and we ask, is it possible to make space travel? So theoretically, yes. If you study Archimedes, you study some rules, theoretically it is possible. We may go there, but we don't even know if it's actually practical in our physical universe. So this is not like a low Moore. It's not like computers. We have the chip. We think we can just make it smaller and more cool and do cooler stuff. It's not like that. It's something like, is it possible that we have a self-replicating biological computer doing mining instead of ASICs? Yeah, it's possible. Is it possible that we have like an asteroid, like a meteor rain destroying each single mining farm? Yeah, that's a threat to Bitcoin. That's not impossible. But you have to make. Let's give the right priority to things. Like ACDSA breaking logical qubits is probably less a threat right now than biological self-replicating biominers.
Yeah, I've said this before, but this is exactly like cold fusion or like flying cars or something like that. It's something that the media narrative has sort of like centered on because it just sounds really cool. Quantum computing, do you know anything about that? And a lot of people like to sound smart by mentioning quantum computing in that context. If you actually study quantum computing, you realize like the engineering challenges are enormous. Like they're on the level of cold fusion, right? Like you have to lower the temperature of these atoms to like nano degrees above absolute zero and keep them there for an extended amount of time. And like they're super slow, they take a long time to do, and it's only because of that media narrative that companies have like essentially invested in a lot of it. There's no real practical use for quantum computing yet. At some point maybe you find something, but like a lot of other technologies that are like more mundane that actually change your life, like having wheels on your suitcase or something like that, to take an example from Nassim Taleb, those are much more likely to disrupt something in Bitcoin than something like quantum computing.
I mean, there are practical uses, but like protein folding, physical simulation, those are stuff. The problem is that everybody knew that you could do that with quantum computing, but nobody cared until you have some kind of scare about ACDSA and cryptography. Now everybody's excited. The point is that the theoretic things are not so excited. You can study protein folding and maybe cure AIDS, which is, yeah, not so exciting.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. Because I'm gonna have you end on something more positive than we won't be able to cure AIDS because the the computer's not gonna work. So, what will we be able to do tomorrow from what we're here creating today? I want to hear some positivity.
Protect your own money.
Well, being self-sovereign is the big one, right? Like that's the major thing that I think we can all look forward to. Instead of a nanny state that like controls everything that we do, we can have control over our money. We can be more self-sovereign, and we can get rid of the ills of the fiat standard, which obviously Safety spoke about right before this.
Bitcoin gives us the chance to be free, truly free. You know, money isn't just numbers. It's not this piece of paper you get or this digital thing. It is your time and energy that you spent to earn it. Your lifetime savings is your aggregate lifetime compressed into that value. The preservation of that value and the freedom to transact or store it however you would like is truly a humanitarian sort of issue. It's a fundamental human right. And so that's why I love Bitcoin. I think it is once people go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and find that, once you go into Bitcoin, you really start to question the nature of your reality, your government, religion, money. And once you go down that rabbit hole, you truly begin this kind of hero's journey to understand freedom and why you are a sovereign individual and why you deserve that.
What can you do tomorrow which is positive? Buy Zach's Bucks, my shitcoin. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, guys. That was great. Hey, so we're going to take a 10-minute break. The next panel will start at exactly bottom of the hour. There is an outdoor section if you want to get some air. Please check out the sponsors. I'm going to show some of them because I actually use their stuff. Art's amazing. Embly came. They weren't here yesterday. That's the Bitcoin debit card. It's absolutely awesome. Check it out. Talk to those guys. And yeah, take a 10-minute break. Don't forget about the scammies. Fill out the Scammy Awards. Please fill out the ballot. And we're going to kick this off again in about 10 minutes. got Giacomo Zucco. We got Willie Woo. Come on up, guys. Grab a seat. You're in the corner. You're next to G. Yeah. Trace Mayer, calling Trace. I know, this is why we don't take breaks. Oh, also, guys, we have a photo booth outside. Feel free to use the photo booth, take some pictures. It's great. We also have some poker chips outside as well. Feel free to grab one. Our custom poker chips. Grab one or two. I don't want to walk through the airport again with like metal case looking like this now. It creates a lot of questions being asked to me. Peter McCormick, where are you? And Bobby Lee, calling Bobby Lee. Come on up. All right, well, I'll fill in for Trace until we find him. Yep. Oh, can someone? Computer. Slides. All right. We're gonna let you kick it off, and I'll take Trace's place.
Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Come on, Tone. How you doing, Bobby?
Good. Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Are you on?
Good morning, Las Vegas.
Hi, Willie.
Hey, man.
How many of you are in? Actually, never mind. I was just, how many Nevada people here?
Hi, Giacomo.
I'm actually Rodolfo Novak.
Hello, Rodolfo. Rodolfo, Willie, Trace, and Bobby. All right, so we've got a panel now which is discussing the road to mass adoption. So I just wanted to kick it off really firstly by asking, what do we actually mean by mass adoption? You can start, Bobby.
Well, for me, mass adoption would be for people outside of this room, for our friends and family, for our parents and children and cousins, to start buying and holding cryptocurrency, and ideally Bitcoin, but cryptocurrency is fine too.
So for me, mass adoption means that people are using Bitcoin and you no longer have to explain it, like the way we use email today. And I like to use email less and less today. I like doing everything through direct messaging, even sending files. I find that more convenient. So mass adoption to me means people are using Bitcoin freely, and you no longer have to explain to people what Bitcoin is. So you don't have to explain like, what internet is. That's mass adoption to me.
To me, it would be the majority of the world population having exposure to the asset class, the market cap of Bitcoin being large enough in the multi-trillion, maybe 10 trillion above, and it having a major impact in world macro markets.
I personally will not measure adoption as a percentage of people in the world, but as a percentage of people that can actually use Bitcoin with profit right now. People who need Bitcoin. Right now, I think a lot of people need Bitcoin, but they don't use it because it's too new, it's too strange, it's something not yet there. So if I see a high percentage of people, for example, who would like to trade online, but they can't because they don't have a bank KYC identity, using Bitcoin for that, that's mass adoption. I mean, they can do that now, but they don't know it, so it will take time. If a lot of gray and black market uses Bitcoin, that's mass adoption. Of course, black market and gray market are basically unregulated free markets, and one of the most important unregulated activity that you can perform today is saving. So black market saving and gray market saving, so being allowed to save your money and your wealth, even if you are not given an explicit political permission, is the most important use case today, in my opinion, just as Saifedean explained. So when most of the people will start to save in Bitcoin because they're forbidden to save in with other monetary means, that's basically mass adoption. It will take a while, but we have time.
Trace, hi.
Oh, thanks. Sorry.
It's okay. So before we get into the road to mass adoption, the first question I asked was, what does mass adoption really mean?
I mean, I think it's a lot of people being aware of the brand, being aware of the understanding of what they might need to use it for, and exactly what Giacomo was talking about. You know, in this world of financial repression, gold price suppression scheme, interest rate suppression scheme, just the rise of the state and the power that they've had over the purse and over money. You know, the pendulum swings back and forth throughout history. We had the Bank of England collapse, and so Isaac Newton created the gold standard, and you know, we had the continental dollar collapse and the French assignat. Like, the pendulum swings back and forth, and the pendulum has just swung so far in terms of the power that the state has over property and over money and things like this, that, you know, life always finds a way from Jurassic Park, right? And the apex predator is hatched out of its egg, and that stock to flow ratio is coupled with high censorship resistant properties, or these properties that constitute sound money. And for that, you have to look at the qualitative theory of money. And so why are you hiring the asset or the good? Like, what job is it performing? And when we look at that, you know, you can look at sound money, and you need scarcity and censorship resistance, and in the information age you need extensibility, you need divisibility, portability, durability, indestructibility, you need privacy, anonymity, fungibility, which are currently, you know, weak spots on Bitcoin, but life finds a way. It always does. And that pendulum is swinging away from this state-controlled money towards the individual again. And I think the thesis in the sovereign individual about changing the economics of violence and how asymmetric cryptography does that is what is part of the large macro trend that's driving it. And so then, you know, number go up, right? Like, everybody wants to chase the rabbit, and that's where the mass adoption comes, is, you know, that first network effect of speculation and everybody chasing the rabbit so that they're able to protect their retirement accounts. You know, because this is also the largest wealth transfer in the history of humanity. And so, like, are you going to be a beneficiary of the wealth transfer or not? And, you know, and so mass adoption just drives through all of those human emotions and that human action. And so that's kind of how I see it, is, you know, there's this need to be able to protect yourself against the state that is confiscating everything. They're confiscating it through inflation. They're now adding a little box on your tax return. They're tracking everything on chain. They're paying chain analysis a bunch of money to do it. Munchin is going to be enforcing the travel rule. So any exchanges that don't attach all of this personal identifying information to your transactions will be decapitated, because if Kraken sends Bitcoin to Binance on behalf of the customer, and the customer even makes the representation that it's going to a personal wallet, Kraken can still be fined, and Binance can be fined $5,000 per day per occurrence. And 70% of transactions are intra-exchange. So if you're not including all this information, you're done. And, you know, sure, we might want the exchanges to be in the fighting truth to power business ideologically, but as the CEO of Netflix said, we're not in that business. We're in the entertainment business. And so in order to maintain the liquidity pools, what do we have to do pragmatically? Because we're not going to get mass adoption if it's extremely difficult and there aren't liquidity pools for the coins. So, this is a big, complicated game that we're playing, and there's a lot that the regulators can do in wielding the violence against, the different institutions and organizations. But, mass adoption, when people start making a bunch of money, they start getting political influence, and they start passing laws like we've done in Wyoming, with property rights being defined with digital assets, and setting up constitutional fights and challenges between the feds and the states. And the states, they're going to be fighting because they want the job creation happening there. And so then you get the governor being like, hey, Caitlin, where are my applications for the banks? You start getting political will. And the technology can get it out there, but we have to have the political will to keep it there. And so the mass adoption becomes a critical part of that.
Well, fuck Mnuchin.
Yeah, but he's Secretary of the Treasury appointed by the President of the United States. And the government is this law.
Well, I've got a question for you
is
then.
Is a primary protocol that the society operates on. You can rage against it all you want. And you know what it's going to get you? Ask Ross Ulbricht.
Well, so I've got a
He's
question.
not getting out,
No,
ever. He
well-
lost his appeal. He's done.
Well, no, he will come out one day.
No,
Agreed.
not
Agreed.
only with the presidential pardon.
Well,
Okay,
with
sorry.
mass adoption, but
If I can add up, my definition of mass adoption is people funding with Bitcoin and is a private mercenary to get Ross out. That's mass adoption.
yeah, he'll be out. So I do have a question for you then, because you've talked therefore about the state having the ability to seize from us at will and more power. And as we head into a election in November in the US, and I visited a Trump rally yesterday and saw lots of happy Trump supporters. And what we have here is a divided country, but who are politically aligned. As we go into an election, you'll have them probably, let's just for the sake of argument say, half the country supporting Trump and then half the supporters, the country supporting whoever the DNC allow. Therefore, we have people who support the state because they're getting behind, they're cheerleading for their leader. So how do we ever get people to actually move to a position where they revolt against the state? Because if your point is that the state is increasing their power, how do we do anything when everyone's still loving them?
Well, I mean, Bloomberg loves to not pay taxes, right? Like the more people that have to check that box and write a big check to the IRS, the more painful it gets politically to keep having that type of stuff in place. So, it's mass adoption with the number going up and people having to pay their taxes because they're all locked in with a travel rule. Guess what? They're going to start talking to their representatives and stuff like that. And fortunately, in the Western democracies, for the most part, we have fair and honest elections, and we have a way to change the process without 20 or 30 million dead people. That's the only way you change it in China. And so, at least we have that ability and that option here. And that's what we're doing in Wyoming, and we have other states that Tyler and I have met with legislators from other states, and they're copying that legislation. So we got good hodler legislation out there first, with strong property rights at the state level. It's a process to move society as a whole. But the economics can really drive a lot of that, and taxes really help unite people, when they start having to pay them.
Okay. Willie, I've got a question for you. As I travel the world and do my job and I meet people, whether I'm checking into a hotel or if I'm in a bar and somebody turns around and says, what do you do? I say, I have a Bitcoin podcast. I almost never get somebody say to me, oh, what is Bitcoin? So I think we have mass awareness. We have mass awareness. I regularly preach to my friends on Facebook about the problems with central banks and how inflation is terrible for their money and their savings, yet we still don't have mass adoption. So why is that?
I guess people, they don't need to, they've made the own subjective value calculation, and they've decided they don't need to hire Bitcoin to accomplish what most people are hiring it for. They feel just fine in their Apple stock or their Tesla stock. or wherever they're allocating their capital, if they even have any. A lot of people are in debt. They don't have the disposable income. They have been kept on life support with the credit system. There's a lot of misallocated capital out there, and a lot of people, want to keep living in the trying to avoid the final crack up boom. But it's coming whether you like it or not. So gonna get yourself protected or not.
Can I get a stab at it, or should?
Well, I did ask Willie.
I'll just say, human nature is one that looks at things in a linear stance. So we're not very good at looking at exponential growth, which is obviously what Bitcoin is doing. So the equivalent question is, the internet was invented in the 1960s, 1994 now, and why don't we have mass adoption? But the thing is, it was growing at a very hyperbolic rate. And if you were to look at where we are on that adoption curve, we're 1% of the world population holding this asset class. And if you look at the rate of which that's growing, which is 2x every year, so there's kind of a Moore's law of adoption happening right now. It's a 4x in a bull market. If you run those numbers, we're going to have half the world using this stuff within 7 years. So when you say, why don't we have mass adoption? Well, it's happening now. And by the time we hit like 5%, 15%, it'll be just a year or two away before it's there. So I'd look at the model of the internet and what happened by the time we hit the 2000s. There'll be a lot of change.
Can I go?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. So for me, I think the two biggest challenges I've seen people in terms of mass adoption are how to buy Bitcoin and how to store Bitcoin. So how to buy traditionally has been difficult. There's been exchanges more and more now in the world, but it's the process, the KYC, the bank transfer. It turns out the hardest part to buying Bitcoin is actually moving the traditional money into an exchange, moving it in, moving it out, proving it, and so on. So that's what the exchanges have to do. I've sold my exchange, so I'm out of business. We'll leave the exchange operator to deal with how to buy Bitcoin. And of course, there's OTC, there's peer-to-peer, and stuff like that. Now what I'm focused on is how to store and hold Bitcoin. It turns out Bitcoin is just information. In the end, it's about the private keys you have. That's the Bitcoin, how you prove you own it. So it's information. On the one hand, if you're savvy with IT and computer science, it's easy to store information. But for the 99% of the world, it's actually very hard to manage secure private key information. Right? Think about it. Who in their right mind would wake up like, oh yeah, I'm excited today. I'm gonna go manage my private keys today. Right? So it's a very hard process, and which is why my new venture, Ballet, we're trying to address that, trying to make private keys easy for the 99% of the people. And by the way, they're not in this room. Right? They're far away. It's the 5 billion people who are not in this room.
Like who?
Oh, grandma, parents, just everyone you see on the street, like every person you met up until you stepped into this room.
Yeah, I completely agree about. Oh, sorry, Bob.
Oh, like here's a good use case. Say my friend and his wife, they just got pregnant, and my grandmother gave me savings bonds, and when I was 18, 20, that's when I cashed my savings bonds in. So I had them like 10, 15 years. So I had these savings bonds 10, 15 years, right? If I want to give my friend's new child some Bitcoin that they're going to use perhaps for college in 10 or 15 years, how do I do that? And
here, now you can.
and I want to give it in a way, especially if I were giving it to family, because I want family reunions to not be awkward. And one way to make a family reunion awkward is you gave the niece or someone some Bitcoin and then it disappeared. And you touch those private keys. So I need something where I can't